The Colorado sky that morning was the color of a bruise that wouldn't heal. A woman stood in the middle of a dirt road, alone, holding everything she owned in a flour sack small enough to carry with one hand, behind her a closed door. In front of her 40 miles of mountain country where men went to disappear. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She walked north. 3 miles into the rocks, she found blood on the stone. Fresh, a drag mark. Then a handprint pressed into the dust at the height of a man who could no longer stand. She should have kept walking. She didn't. What she found in those rocks would cost her everything she had left and force the most powerful man in the county to answer for 12 years of lies in front of every soul in Red Rock Flats. But first, she had a wounded man to keep alive, and a war she didn't know yet she was already in. The morning May Eleanor Briggs got thrown away, the sky over Red Rock Flats was the color of a bruise healing wrong. Purplish at the edges, gray at the center, the kind of sky that doesn't promise anything and keeps its word. She would lose everything before noon, and before the year was out, she would build something better than what she lost. But that was later. That was after. Right now, she was in the yard behind the house, and her father was walking toward her with his hat in his hands. Henry Briggs walked slow, the way a man walks when he's already decided something terrible and just needs his body to catch up to the decision. Dorothy followed 3 steps behind, wiping her hands on her apron though there was nothing on them, which told May everything before either of them opened their mouths. Because clean hands don't get wiped. Clean hands don't need something to do with themselves. She kept scrubbing the wash, kept her back to them. She'd learned early that if you didn't look at trouble coming, you could sometimes control what your face did when it arrived. May, her father's voice had gone hollow, like a well someone had stopped drawing water from. She turned around. He was holding a bundle wrapped in flour sackcloth. Her things, her good dress, her grandmother's thimble, the $3 she'd tucked under the floorboard by the window money she'd been saving since October, $1 at a time, for reasons she hadn't fully named yet but had known she would need. He'd found it, or looked for it. She didn't know which was worse. "Sit down, Henry." That was Dorothy. Soft. Apologetic in the particular way of people who've already stopped fighting and just want the other person to catch up to the surrender. "I don't need to sit." May let the rag fall into the wash water. Her hands were still wet. The cold morning air hit them and she did not move to dry them. "Tell me what this is?" Henry looked at the bundle instead of her. "Warren Calhoun came to see me. There it was. He says if you leave the county before sundown today, he'll mark the debt settled." Henry swallowed. His jaw worked like he was chewing on the next words and finding them bitter going down. The whole thing. 40 years of it. May stood very still. Not because she was calm, because she was calculating, running through every version of this conversation she might have rehearsed with herself in the dark at 2 in the morning, deciding which one was actually true. She'd thought about Calhoun before. Everyone in Red Rock Flats thought about Calhoun. He was the kind of man who made himself unavoidable. 40,000 acres stretching north toward the mountains. A house with a porch so wide you could stable horses on it. 4 ranch hands who wore their guns tilted the way men do when they want you to notice the guns without having to say anything about them. And her father owed him. Had owed him since the drought year, when the well went dry and the corn didn't come up, and Henry Briggs had gone to Calhoun like half the county had gone to Calhoun, hat in hand, borrowing against next year's hope. Next year never paid it back. Neither did the year after. "How long have you known he was going to ask for this?" May's voice came out quieter than she meant it to. Henry's mouth opened, closed. Dorothy made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "How long, Papa?" "He mentioned it last month." Henry finally looked at her. His eyes were red at the rims. She didn't know if that was grief or just the cold morning air. "I told him no." "I said no, May, you have to believe that." But then he sent Cole Danner out to count the cattle, and Danner said there was some question about the boundary line on the south field and you changed your mind. Silence, silence. Not the kind where someone is thinking. The kind where someone already thought and can't take it back. May looked at her mother. Dorothy was staring at the ground. Her lips were moving slightly, which meant she was either praying or working herself up to say something she'd decided not to say. Either way, she wasn't going to be useful. "I'm not going to beg," May said. "I'm not going to cry in front of you, but I want you to hear me say it plain. What you're doing right now is not about the debt. The debt is just the story you're telling yourself so you can sleep." Henry's face went a tight. May, you're trading me because you're afraid of him and you don't know another way out. And that's your land and your debt, and I suppose it's your right. She picked up the bundle from where he'd set it on the fence post. Light, pathetically light. 20 years of being someone's daughter and it fit in a flour sack. But don't you tell yourself it was about the debt? Don't you do that to yourself? She put on her boots. The left one had a split seam she'd been meaning to fix. She hadn't gotten around to it. She thought about that briefly, the things you don't get around to because you assume you have more time. And then she stopped thinking about it entirely. Dorothy made that sound again. Half word, half nothing, May walked out the front gate. She didn't look back at the house. She heard the gate latch click behind her and she kept walking, and the sky was still that wrong healing bruise color, and somewhere up on the ridge a meadowlark was going through its whole song, like it had no idea what kind of morning this was. She didn't cry, not yet, not there, not where anyone could see. Red Rock Flats had maybe 200 souls on its best day, and on its worst day it had all 200 of them out where they could watch you. That was the particular cruelty of small towns in Colorado Territory in 1879. Everyone knew your business before you knew it yourself. The general store, the livery, the single church with the bell that needed rehanging, the saloon that kept shorter hours than it used to since the previous marshal had been shot in it 3 years back, all of it strung along Main Street like beads on a wire, close enough that sound carried end to end when the wind was right. May kept her head level, eyes forward, shoulders back, pace steady. The walk of a woman who has somewhere to be, even when she didn't, especially when she didn't. She was passing the alley between the feed store and the land office when she heard the horses, 3 of them, no 4. Coming up from the south end of Main Street at a pace that said this wasn't social, Warren Calhoun rode the black horse. He always rode the black horse. It was 16 hands, and it had the kind of temperament that matched its owner, outwardly controlled, with something working underneath that you didn't want to test. 2 riders flanked him, both wearing the flat-brimmed hats his ranch hands favored. A third man brought up the rear on a roan mare. They stopped in front of the deputy's office. May slowed her pace. Not stopped would be noticed. She slowed, and she drifted toward the edge of the boardwalk, and she found a reason to be interested in the window of the feed store, which had a display of seed packets she had no intention of buying. Cole Danner came out of the office. Deputy Marshal. Badge on his chest like an afterthought. He had the kind of face that wanted to be friendly and had learned not to be, which gave him the permanent expression of a man arguing with himself about something and losing. He said something to Calhoun that May couldn't catch from this distance. Calhoun leaned down from the saddle, unhurried. The way men lean when they've never had reason to hurry because the world rearranges itself around them before they need to. I want the businessmen's handled this week, Cole. Not raised. Not commanding, more like a statement of expectation, the way you'd tell the weather what temperature you preferred. The families along the river are dragging their feet. They need something to push them along. Danner nodded. Once, twice, the nod of a man whose neck has become accustomed to the motion. And the Briggs situation, Calhoun said something lower. May caught her father's name, caught the word settled, caught the flat satisfaction in Calhoun's voice that came with a man who has moved a piece on a board and watched it land where he intended. He straightened in the saddle. Already looking away, already moving to the next thing in his day. He hadn't looked at May once. She was a transaction that had been completed, a line item, an account that had been cleared and filed. Something went cold in her chest. Not the burning thing she'd expected. Cold and clean and very specific, like water from a deep well that shocks you because you didn't know how thirsty you were until it hit. She turned away from the seed packets and kept walking north. She had a bundle and $3 and a pair of boots with a split seam. She had nowhere to sleep tonight and nobody waiting for her, and a county that had been quietly informed without announcement to let her go. Warren Calhoun didn't need to threaten people individually. He just needed to make clear that his protection extended to those who cooperated. Everyone else understood the implication without needing it explained. What he didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, standing on opposite ends of Main Street on a gray Colorado morning, was that May Eleanor Briggs was about to follow a trail of blood into the rocks and make a decision that would undo 3 years of his most careful work. But that came later. First came the walking. The road north out of Red Rock Flats turned to packed dirt within a mile and to loose rock within 2. Scrub oak thickened on either side. The elevation climbed almost immediately, the kind of gradual ascent you don't notice for the first hour, and then suddenly your legs are burning, and you realize you've been working much harder than you thought. May had been walking for 3 hours when she saw the first sign. She almost missed it. The blood on the rock wasn't dramatic, not a pool, not a scene. It was a drag pattern, a dark smear across the flat face of a sandstone ledge, the kind of mark something large leaves while passing through at a speed slower than walking, and 3 feet beyond it, a handprint, not clean. Pressed into the dust on the rock's edge, the shape of fingers slightly blurred, the way a print looks when the person making it was leaning rather than choosing. She knew she should keep moving. She knew it the way she knew the split seam in her boot would let the cold in eventually, practically, specifically, without drama attached. Keep walking north. Don't follow blood on rocks. Don't go toward trouble when you've just gotten clear of one variety of it. Except she followed because the handprint sat at the height of someone sitting, not standing. Because the drag marks deepened where weight had been managed rather than simply carried. And because, though she couldn't have explained this to anyone's satisfaction, something in the pattern reminded her of the way her father had walked across the yard that morning. The movement of a person getting through something they had no choice but to get through. She went another 40 yards into the scrub, threading between boulders that the creek had moved down from the ridge sometime before anyone in this territory was counting years. The shadows deepened. The rock walls narrowed into a natural shelter, not a cave, just an overhang and 2 large stones creating 3 sides of a room. The kind of hollow a deer would use, the kind a man would choose if he needed to stop and understood that stopping in the open was not an option. He was sitting against the far stone with his back to the rock and his right side toward her, and his eyes were closed. And then they weren't. The gun was in his hand before she'd fully registered that she was seeing a man. Not drawn, it had been there already, resting against his thigh, and what changed was the angle. The barrel came up not fast but certain, the way a compass needle finds north. Not performance, not threat, pure reflex. The reflex of someone who had been sleeping at half attention for long enough that it was no longer effort. May stopped. Both hands came up. Don't. He looked at her. She looked back, because looking was what you did with new information. Enormous. That was the first word, and she couldn't move past it for a moment. Not tall the way men in saloons called each other, tall, genuinely large in the way of things grown in conditions that required size. 6.5 feet or close. Shoulders wide as a doorframe. The kind of build that would have looked carved from the landscape he was sitting in, except for the blood soaking through the strips of cloth tied around his right side. His face was sun-darkened and bearded, 4 days of it, maybe 5, and covered in the particular mixture of dust and dried sweat that comes from moving hard and sleeping rough. Black hair plastered to his forehead, and his eyes, when they settled on her face, were dark and doing the rapid assessment she recognized because she'd been doing the same thing all morning, running scenarios, checking angles, deciding what this was. She saw him decide she was alone, saw him decide she wasn't armed, saw him keep the gun where it was anyway. I'm not here to hurt you. She kept her hands up. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. She was grateful for that. I followed the blood on the rocks. He watched her. You're losing too much. She glanced at the improvised bandage. Dark cloth, not freshly dark. The bleeding had been slowing, but not stopped. How long ago? Nothing, I know, Ruth Callaway. She took a slow half step forward, his arm tensed. She stopped. The woman who does midwifing in Red Rock Flats. I've watched her work. I'm not going to hurt you. And I'm not going to run back to town and report anything. I just need you to let me see what I'm dealing with. The calculation behind his eyes was visible. She could watch it happening, the weighing of risk against the very real problem of his side. He was already pale under the sun dark. His breathing was controlled but shallow. A man holding himself together through conscious effort rather than physical reserves. Cabin. His voice came out rough, like something unused, 1/4 mile east, not permission. But it wasn't the gun either. Getting him to the cabin took 20 minutes and used more of May than she'd anticipated. He was heavier than she'd accounted for, which she should have expected, given the scale of him. But there's a difference between knowing a fact and having its full weight lean against your shoulder. He moved carefully despite the wound, setting his feet with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that a bad step here cost more than it would somewhere else. But he was drawing on reserves. She felt it in how the pressure against her shoulder changed between the first 100 yards and the last. Lighter at the start, more of him by the end, the cabin was small. A trapper's structure or something built when the silver claim 2 miles north was still someone's hope. Dry inside, a shelf with rusted tins, a water barrel with about 6 inches remaining. An old blanket folded across a wooden frame that had lost one leg and leaned against the wall as a result. She settled him against the wall with the good light from the single window falling on his right side. He allowed it, which told her how far he'd traveled from where he'd started this day. She used her own knife, small but sharp, to cut away the improvised bandage. The wound underneath was deep and clean-edged in the way that only blades produce. Not a bullet. She knew bullet wounds from listening to Ruth describe them, the way the flesh tears differently depending on the entry angle. This was a knife wound or something functionally identical, tracking from the floating rib downward and stopping before it reached anything that would have been fatal more quickly. It had been bleeding for hours. Not catastrophically, nothing vital had been opened, but steadily enough. This needs stitching. She didn't frame it as a question. She started going through her bundle, taking inventory. Not much. Then she remembered Ruth saying once, in the offhand way Ruth said things that turned out to be essential. Fishing line, stronger than thread, holds better under rough conditions. Works when you have no alternative. Saddlebag. His eyes were still tracking the door. Even now, against a wall with a knife wound open at his side, some part of him was monitoring the approach from outside. Rolled line, left inside pocket. She found it. Found a small steel flint beside it. A folded piece of leather that might have been a map before weather got to it. A handful of jerked beef wrapped in canvas. She heated her knife blade in the fire she built from scrap wood stacked inside the door. Boiled water in the tin cup from the shelf. Ran the fishing line through the hot water 3 times and let it sit. This is going to hurt. She said it because he deserved to know, not because the warning would change anything. Everything hurts. He said it without self-pity, which was almost harder to hear than if he'd said it with some. The flatness of it factual, like pointing at an overcast sky and naming the color. Like pain had become so consistent a condition that variation in tone no longer applied. She worked fast and as carefully as fast permitted. 14 stitches. Her hands trembled on the 4th one, not from fear, but from the specific strain of doing something requiring absolute precision, while also trying not to cause more damage than necessary. She got past the trembling. She kept her breathing even, and she watched the needle, and she did not think about anything else. He made no sound throughout. His hands were closed on his thighs. On stitch 7, his jaw set in a way that pulled the muscles of his neck tight, and it stayed that way until she tied off the last knot. Not a sound. She bandaged the wound with strips from the bottom of her extra shirt, not clean by any clinical standard, but cleaner than what had been there before, and tight enough to matter. She sat back on her heels. Her arms were shaking faintly, and she didn't have the energy to pretend otherwise. "Your name," she said. He looked at her for a moment that stretched. Callaway. Seth Callaway. The name arrived with weight. Everyone in 50 miles knew it. Seth Callaway, the man on the mountain. The one Cole Danner had been tasked to locate. The one Calhoun's men had ridden out after on 3 separate occasions in the past year and returned from short 2 horses and long on vague accounts about difficult terrain. The ghost on Boulder Break that mothers in Red Rock Flats invoked when their children asked why they couldn't go north of the creek. She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of someone who has watched people recognize his name before and knows precisely which direction the recognition runs. "I'm May Briggs." She held his gaze. "Before you do whatever you're about to do with your face, I should tell you that this morning my father sold me to pay a debt to the man I'm betting is responsible for that wound. So I'm not currently positioned to be sympathetic to whatever Warren Calhoun wants the county to think about you." Something shifted in his expression, not enough to name easily, but something moved. Calhoun's men, he confirmed. 3 of them came up to the north face 2 days ago. Wasn't their first visit? The pause of a man choosing words the way you choose footing on loose shale. "I defended myself?" "I gathered that." She looked at his hands. The knuckles of his left hand were scraped raw, not from the wound, from something else entirely. "How many went back to him?" 2. she nodded. Filed that. He's already got Dana looking. I heard him on Main Street this morning telling Dana the River families need something to push them. I think you're meant to be that something. Seth looked at the door again, back at her. The assessment she'd seen before was running again, but differently now. She was no longer part of the threat calculation. She had moved into the resource calculation, which was progress of a specific kind. Why are you telling me this? She set the remaining jerked beef in front of him. Not all of it, she kept half, because she was also going to need to eat today, but the larger portion. Because this morning I was told my only option was to walk away and let other people decide what happened to everything around me. She met his eyes. I don't accept that. And you're bleeding, and the most useful thing I can do right now is give you both pieces of information. He looked at the beef, looked at her. A long pause with weight in it then. Ruth Callaway. She knows you. She's the one who first told me about fishing line. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely, the ghost of a muscle memory for something that had once been easier. She's been keeping this county functional on her own for 30 years while the men argue about importing a doctor. 32 years, she'd tell you, and she'd be precise about it. May wrapped her coat tighter against the cold coming through the cabin walls' gaps. You need to sleep. I need to get back to the edge of town before dark for proper supplies. I'll come back. You'll come back. Not skeptical. Flatter than skeptical. The register of a man who has reorganized his expectations around people not coming back, stated as simple fact. I'll come back, she said. Is there somewhere better than this? Harder to find, he thought. Silver Creek Mine, north and east 3 miles. Hard climb but 3 exits and you can see the valley approach from the main shaft. I know where it is. She picked up her bundle, hesitated, left the larger portion of the jerked beef and took the smaller. Sleep. I'll be back before dark. He watched her at the door. You didn't ask why they're after me. She turned back. Everyone in the county knows the story Calhoun tells. I don't have a reason to accept his version over yours. She looked at him steadily. When I come back, if you want to tell me the real one, I'm listening. She went out into the afternoon light before he could respond to that. Ruth Callaway's house sat at the south end of Red Rock Flats, where the street became a track and the track became a suggestion. Low adobe, a red cloth on the door, a signal May had grown up understanding without being told. Births and illness tended to within, a place that existed slightly outside the town's social jurisdiction, because Ruth's skills made her too valuable to subject to its rules. May went around to the back. Ruth opened the kitchen door before May reached it. She always did that. May had long since stopped being surprised by it. Lord, child. Ruth stepped back to let her in. She was a broad woman who had gone silver at the temples and treated it as a practical development rather than anything else. Her hands were flour-dusted and her expression said she'd already figured out most of this situation and was waiting for the person at the center of it to arrive. I heard about this morning before you'd gotten a mile out, Dorothy at the market. By 7 o'clock, Ruth filled a tin cup with water and set it in front of May without ceremony. Sit, May sat, drank. The water tasted of iron and cold stone and was the best thing she'd had all day. I need wound supplies, she said. Arnica if you have it. Yarrow. Clean linen if you can spare any. Ruth's eyes went still in the way of someone who has just received a piece of information that reorganizes the shape of things. Not alarmed, Ruth didn't do alarmed. Attentive. Whose wound? Someone who needed help and didn't have anyone else providing it. May, Ruth, they looked at each other across the kitchen table. Ruth was the only person who had never required May to be anything other than what she was, and May felt the specific weight of that now, having spent a morning being reminded what it felt like when people did require it. There are men in town, Ruth said. She turned to the back shelf, began moving jars with the efficiency of long practice. Came in last evening. 2 of Calhoun's hands and a 3rd I don't recognize. They've been asking about the Boulder Break area. She didn't turn around. Cole Danner's been with them since this morning. May's hands tightened around the cup. Calhoun raised the reward this week. Ruth came back to the table with a small cloth bundle. $200. That's nearing half a year's wages for most men working this county, which is exactly what it's meant to be. Ruth set the bundle down. Arnica. Yarrow. A small jar of honey, clean linen strips. Enough that men who wouldn't ordinarily consider it will do arithmetic they're not proud of. She paused. There's something else. Agnes Pike, she works Calhoun's house. Has done for years. She came by 2 days ago. Something she wanted to say to someone. I told her to wait because I didn't know what she'd be saying it into. Ruth's eyes met May's. I think that's changed. May stood, tucked the bundle into her bag. Can you get word to Ezra Finch? When he's next through. Ruth studied her with the particular attention she applied to things that mattered. What kind of word? Tell him there's work. The kind he does. 3 copies of whatever I bring him. She held Ruth's gaze. And tell him the man who owes him from 74 may be about to have some significant legal difficulties. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once, the nod of a woman who has assessed a structure and decided it will hold. You're going to need to be careful, May. Sensible careful isn't going to cover it, I know. Calhoun has been operating this way for 12 years. Men who've been doing something that long develop a talent for making it continue. Then we find what stops it. May picked up her bag. The mine on Silver Creek, it still has 3 exits? Ruth looked at her steadily. Last I knew, she had understood the question before it was fully asked, which was characteristic. Come back safe. A pause. And May, whatever you're deciding, make sure it's a decision. Not a reaction to this morning. May walked out into the late afternoon. The shadows on Main Street were long now, the sun dropping toward the ridge, and she moved quickly because she had a 3-mile climb ahead of her and she'd promised to be back before dark. She was nearly clear of the south end when she slowed involuntarily. The voices from the open side door of the saloon were not being kept quiet. 2 men, Calhouns by the hats. The comfortable posture of people who've already had a drink and are settled into the good part of an afternoon. Man killed Jackson with his bare hands. That's what Dana said. I heard it was a blade. I heard both. Don't matter. Point is Calhoun wants him found and he's putting up 200 to do it. A low sound. That's more than a winter. That's a winter and a horse. May kept walking. Didn't change her pace. Her face did nothing. Her feet kept their rhythm and she turned north at the end of Main Street and didn't adjust her speed until the last houses of Red Rock Flats had thinned out behind her. $200. Anyone helping him shares his situation. She walked faster. She needed to move Seth out of that cabin before morning. She needed to reach him before Calhoun's men thought to widen their search past the first ridge. She stopped that line of thought and organized it. What she needed right now, specifically, was to get back to the cabin before dark. Everything else could sequence from there. The sun was 3 fingers above the ridge when she reached the cabin door. Seth was awake. He'd moved himself to face the entrance, she could tell by the disturbed dust on the floor, and had the gun resting on his thigh again. His color was marginally better, which wasn't a high bar but was above it. He'd eaten the jerked beef, all of it, which was the right choice. She came in and set Ruth's bundle down and started unwrapping the herbs without preamble. We have a problem, one. Start with the largest. Calhoun's men have been in town since yesterday, and they're asking specifically about the Boulder Break area. She found the arnica, began preparing a poultice against the tin cup. Someone saw me go north this morning. If they're methodical and Calhoun doesn't hire people who aren't, they'll start checking the shelters and cabins along the first ridge by tomorrow at the latest. Seth watched her hands work. The mine is 3 miles, I know. Ruth confirmed it has 3 exits. She paused. She knew about it before I asked. Ruth knows most things before they're asked. Something close to warmth in his voice. Minimal, but present. Different when it's directed at you, though. She smoothed the new bandage into place. He was still through all of it, the particular stillness of someone who has made a complete decision about allowing a thing to happen and committed to that decision without reservation. No flinching, no commentary, no performance. Calhoun raised it to 200, she said. Nothing in his expression changed, which was itself an answer about how many times he'd already processed the fact of a price on his name. That's not the piece that matters most, she continued. What matters is what I heard him tell Dana this morning. The families along the river need something to push them. He's using you, not just hunting you, actively using the fear of you to move people off water rights he wants. She looked at him directly. I want to understand what that looks like from where you've been standing. Seth was quiet for a moment that had genuine weight. Outside, the wind had come up. It moved through the cabin's gaps and stirred the ash in the unused side of the fireplace, and May watched him decide something about how much to give. I've been on Boulder Break 3 years, he said at last. Didn't come down, didn't bother anyone. Trapped, moved around, stayed north of the creek, His hands were loose on his knees. She'd noticed that he kept his hands deliberately open when he was speaking honestly, the opposite of the closed fists during the stitching. First 6 months, nobody paid attention. 7th month, a family named Pearson lost a grain supply from an outbuilding. Cole Danner rode up and asked if I'd seen anything. I hadn't. He wrote it down as unknown, a pause. Month later, Kellerman's fence line on the North River branch was torn up. Cattle scattered. Danner rode out again. Started suggesting it could have been me. May felt the shape of what was coming before he said it. Kellerman sold to Calhoun the following week. Said the area had become too dangerous to work. Seth looked at the wall across from him. 6 months after that, the Reinhold family, North Branch, their barn went up. Middle of the night. Nobody hurt, but everything in it gone. The flatness in his voice had a different quality now, not absence of feeling, but feeling under significant compression. Reinhold came to me after, climbed up to where I was camped and told me he'd seen men coming from the south, not the mountain. Said one of them wore a hat he knew belonged to one of Calhoun's riders, but he left anyway. His wife was expecting their second. He said he couldn't risk staying. Seth's eyes came back to her face, but he told me what he saw before he left. May let that sit. She was building the structure of it in her head, the full shape, the logic of it, and no one believed him because by then everyone was already living inside the story Calhoun had made about you. By then I was the story. It's easier to believe a story you've already accepted than to look at who profits from it being believed. She held his gaze. Did you know it was staged? The attacks? I suspected within the first year. When Danner's men came for me the 3rd time in 8 months, I stopped suspecting. His jaw tightened briefly. I defended myself. Same as the first 2 times and same as 2 days ago. And this time one of them didn't come back. No, she nodded. Didn't look away. He noticed that she could see the small recalibration of something in how he looked at her after. All right, she said. All right, he repeated, trying out whether she meant it. We need to move you tonight. Before they extend the search past the creek, she began repacking the bundle. Can you make 3 miles uphill? I can make 3 miles, she stood. He stood slower, using the wall. The full height of him in the small space of the cabin was something that required a moment of adjustment, not threatening, exactly, but present in the way that geography is present. Unavoidable. Factual. She picked up her bundle. He took his saddlebag. At the door he said, without inflection, why not a question with a specific answer attached? Something more foundational. The word of a man who has been trained by accumulated experience to expect a motive behind apparent generosity and can't locate one here that he recognizes. She thought about it honestly, not the fast answer. The real one, because this morning I learned I was something that could be handed over, she said. I don't believe that's what I am. And the only way to prove it, not to anyone else, to myself, is to not do the same thing when I have the choice not to. She pushed the door open. The night air came in cold and carrying the smell of pine and coming frost. Come on, we go east first to break the track. Then north. He stood in the doorway looking at her for one more moment. Then he stepped through it. Above, Boulder Break. The stars were out in numbers that the town's lamplight never let you see properly. And below them 2 people moved north through the scrub oak with the careful, unhurried pace of those who have somewhere to be, and only one way to get there. May didn't look back at the cabin. She had her grandmother's thimble in her coat pocket, and $3 she hadn't spent, and a direction that was forward. Forward was all there was now. The mine smelled like old earth and cold mineral and time. Not unpleasant. Just ancient, the smell of a place that had been doing its own work long before people arrived with lamps and ambitions, and would go right back to it after they were finished. Silver Creek Mine had given up its last ore in 1871, and had been giving up nothing since, which suited May's purposes exactly. She had been here once before, at 13. Following 2 older boys on a dare she'd issued herself because no one else was going to. She remembered the way sound changed when you crossed the threshold, everything outside going muffled, everything inside becoming close and specific. The smell was identical. 8 years hadn't touched it. What 8 changed was everything else. Seth moved through the space with the focused attention of someone mapping it against future need. Not hurried, methodical. He checked the first side tunnel with one hand on the wall and came back. Checked the second. Located the third exit near the rear, where the rock had fractured along a natural seam wide enough for a man his size to pass through sideways. His side was costing him. She could read it in how he held his right arm, fractionally higher than necessary, compensating without deciding to, but he didn't acknowledge it, and she didn't name it yet. There was an order to things, and injury came after shelter was confirmed. She built the fire deep in the shaft, in the natural depression where the rock widened into a room-sized chamber. Small fire. The draft moved through the mountain from below, rather than pulling back out the entrance, which meant smoke dispersed through the upper fissures, rather than signaling their location from outside. She'd noticed the air movement on the walk in the way the mine exhaled rather than inhaled and had filed it. Seth settled against the east wall, where the stone held warmth better than the others. He chose it without discussion, the same way he'd chosen the position in the cabin that gave him sightlines to the door. 3 years of making the right choices by instinct because the wrong ones were not recoverable. They split what remained of the food. He didn't argue about the division, which she appreciated. Some men made an argument out of every small thing as a way of establishing that they were the kind of man who made arguments. Seth Callaway was not that kind. The fire settled into a steady rhythm. Outside, the Colorado night pressed against the mountain, and the mountain held its ground without effort. "You know this mine," he said. "Not a question. I grew up 15 miles south. When you're 13 with nothing better to do, you make geographically questionable decisions." She pulled her coat tighter. "I also know that the creek running below it feeds into the Pearson property, and then the Kellerman land, and then curves east toward Reinholdt's old boundary before it reaches the main river." He looked at her. "The water source," she said. "If you control the upper reach of that creek, you control everything downstream. Every family you named, every piece of land Calhoun has been working to acquire." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's been trying to buy the North Bank water rights for 4 years, and failing. Because the families there hold rights that predate any of his claims. Until they get frightened enough to walk away, there it was. The complete shape of the thing. Not a story about a dangerous man in the mountains. A story about water and land, and a man who needed a different story to make people abandon both. He needed something to scare them, May said. Something that wasn't him and couldn't be traced back to him. Something the county would accept as reason enough for people to leave, and I was already there. Seth said it without bitterness. Just the flat recognition of a man accounting for how he'd been used. Inconvenient to explain, easy to blame. You made yourself useful to him by existing where you did, I know. A pause that carried the weight of having known this for some time. I've been working out the shape of it for 2 years. Didn't have the pieces to prove it. Just the pattern and the timing and the knowledge that the men who came up after me weren't acting on their own initiative. She added a piece of wood to the fire. The light jumped and resettled. Then we need to find the pieces. He looked at her across the fire with an expression she couldn't fully read, yet she was still learning his face, which was a face that gave things slowly and took them back quickly. "You're already planning. I've been planning since Main Street." She met his eyes. Someone inside Calhoun's operation has seen things. Someone who moves through that house invisibly enough that no one thought to stop saying things in front of them. She thought of what Ruth had said about Agnes Pike. Kept that to herself for now, because it wasn't hers to give until she'd heard it directly. And there's a Reinholdt in this county who told you what he saw. He'll tell it again if the right person asks him the right way. Seth looked at the fire. Reinholdt left because he had a family to protect. His brother Thomas didn't leave, still in Red Rock Flats, works at the livery. She watched Seth's expression. "You didn't know that. I don't come down, I know." She said it without judgment. "That's going to have to The silence after that was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people, sitting with a true thing that neither of them was going to pretend was easy. She went down to Red Rock Flats the following night. She'd turned it over through most of the day, running the risk against the alternative. The risk was clear. But there's a difference between risk you walk into without looking and risk you assess and accept. Because the cost of not accepting it is higher. The cost here was waiting while Calhoun's men continued their search, and Agnes Pike continued sitting on whatever she knew, losing confidence in it a little more each day that no one came to hear it. May went around the south side of town, through the dry creek bed behind the tanner's yard, and came up against the back of Ruth's property. The red cloth was down, no patience. She knocked on the kitchen side. Ruth opened it before the second knock. a lamp in one hand. The expression of a woman who had been expecting this visit and had organized her thinking accordingly. Inside, at the kitchen's table, sat a woman May didn't recognize. Middle-aged, narrow through the shoulders. Hands that were rough in the specific way of someone who has done waterwork for years, palms thickened, knuckles permanently reddened, the skin around the nails hardened from repeated wetting and drying. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the table, and she held herself with the practiced compactness of a person who had learned that taking up less space was a form of protection. Ruth set the lamp on the table. May Briggs. Agnes Pike? Agnes looked up. Her eyes were careful and experienced in the way of someone who has observed a great many things and made the professional judgment not to comment on most of them. You work for Calhoun, May said, sitting down across from her. I've worked for Calhoun. Agnes's voice was quiet in the way that still water is quiet, not soft, not weak, but something underneath it that didn't disturb easily. 15 years. Washing, heavy cleaning, setting the table when he has guests. A pause. People stop seeing you after about the 3rd year. You become part of the furniture of the place. May understood that without explanation. Ruth says you have something. May kept her voice level. No pressure in it. You didn't apply pressure to a lamp burning low. I'm not going to push you for it. But I'm here and I'm listening. Agnes looked at her hands. The silence stretched and May let it stretch because this was not a moment for filling. 8 weeks ago, Agnes began. 1st week of November. I was still up past midnight, a bad tooth, couldn't sleep. Saw 3 men leave from the south barn, her hands turned over in her lap, palms up then back down again. Not regular hands. They were wearing different clothes. Rougher, heavy coats, wide-brimmed hats pulled low, and they were carrying torches. May went very still. I watched from my room window. They rode south and then cut east toward the river properties. Agnes's jaw tightened fractionally, the first sign that the still surface had something working beneath it. Morning came. Cole Dana rode in before breakfast. He and Calhoun were in the study for close to an hour. When Dana left, Calhoun came out in the best mood I'd seen him in months. She met May's eyes directly for the first time. I heard Pearson through the study door. I heard Callaway 3 separate times. And Calhoun said I was close enough to be certain of this. He said, that ought to do it for the holdouts. The kitchen stove ticked twice in the silence that followed. Pearson sold within 2 weeks, May said quietly. I served the paperwork dinner. Agnes's mouth compressed. Calhoun brought out the good wine, the cabinet he keeps locked. The kind of wine that only appears when something has gone the way he intended. May held herself very still inside, where she was working through what this meant structurally, what it proved, what it implied, what it still needed. Was that the only time? No flat, no hesitation. I can place 3 separate nights in the past 7 months that follow the same pattern. Men leaving late, Dana appearing the following morning, Calhoun pleased in a way that had a specific texture to it, not general good humor. Satisfaction about a particular thing, and each time, something happened on the river properties. Each time, Agnes looked at her own hands again, and each time afterward, people talked about what the man in the mountains had done. The man in the mountains. Seth's name used the way you use a weather event, something that happens to people. Not something done by a person with reasons. Agnes? May waited until Agnes looked up. Will you say this in front of a clerk? Put your name to it in writing? The pause this time was not hesitation. It was the specific quality of weighing intelligence applied to a decision that had consequences either direction. Yes, Agnes said. I'll put my name on it. Ruth, standing at the stove throughout, set 2 cups on the table without comment. Agnes wrapped her hands around hers. May did the same and let the warmth of it anchor her for a moment. There's more, Agnes said. Smaller things. The way he speaks about the families along the creek, not as people making decisions about their own land, but as pieces that haven't moved to their correct positions yet. She looked at the table, and I heard him say once, about Seth Callaway's family, about the removal in 75, that it had cleared a nuisance. That was the exact word, a long beat. I've thought about that word for 3 years. May did not fill that space. Some things needed to be said and then allowed to exist without being managed. I want to find Ezra Finch, May said at last. He's a clerk, travels through here monthly. Honest man with his own reasons to want Calhoun's affairs examined. I need 3 copies of everything you've just told me, written in language a territorial court won't be able to set aside. She held Agnes's gaze. When Finch comes through, Will you meet with him? When is he expected, Ruth? May glanced at her. Ruth considered. He passed through 6 weeks ago. He's due. She looked at May. 3 days, maybe 4. Agnes nodded once. 3 days I can manage. May stood, then stopped. One more thing. Don't change anything about how you move through that house. Don't look at him differently. Don't avoid the rooms you usually work in. She picked up her bag. You've been doing this 15 years. 4 more days is nothing you haven't already done. Agnes almost smiled. It had the structure of a smile without quite completing itself. That's the truest thing anyone's said to me in a long while. Ruth walked May to the kitchen door, stopped her with one hand briefly on her arm. Be careful going back up. I'm always careful. You're smart, Ruth said. Those aren't the same thing, and you know it. May went out into the dark and moved north through Red Rock Flats by the back ways. And Agnes Pike's voice stayed with her on the climb, the 15 years of it compressed into a kitchen table conversation. The weight of watching and saying nothing, finally finding somewhere to go. Seth was awake when she got back. She'd stopped expecting otherwise. He was working a piece of wood with his smaller knife, his back against the east wall, the fire banked low. She came in cold from the climb, and he looked up and back down at the wood without a word, which she had already learned was his version of acknowledgement. The door staying in her peripheral vision. The posture of someone who registers your presence without performing the registration. She sat down across from him and let her heartbeat settle from the climb. Agnes Pike, she said. 15 years in Calhoun's house. She watched 3 separate groups of his men leave late at night in disguised different clothes, torches, before 3 separate incidents that got blamed on you. She heard him celebrate after. She heard your name and the word holdouts in the same sentence. She watched his face. She'll put her name to all of it in writing. Seth's hands went still on the wood. Not a sharp stillness, gradual, the way a clock winds down when the spring finally goes. And Thomas Reinhold is still in the county, May continued. His brother's the one who left. Thomas is at the livery in town. What his brother told you about seeing lights from the South Bank, Thomas knows that account. He'll say it on record if someone asks him the right way. She waited a beat. Ezra Finch is due through in 3 or 4 days. Honest Clark. His own reasons to want Calhoun's affairs under examination. Calhoun owes him wages from 1874 that he refused to pay. I'm going to have him write the testimony formally. 3 copies. One goes to Denver. Seth set the knife down on his knee. He looked at the wall at a specific point that wasn't anything visible, just the place his eyes went when his attention was somewhere further than the mine. They used my name. His voice had the register she was beginning to understand, not emptiness, but a great deal in a very small container. After Daniel, after Rebecca, while I was up on that mountain with nothing. They used my name to take more. May didn't reach for anything to soften that with. It was true and it was real, and the most dishonest thing she could do would be to offer words that suggested otherwise. Yes, she said. The fire gave a small sound. Outside, the wind moved through the mountain in the long, slow way it had the breath of rock, indifferent and constant. He went back to the wood. She watched his hands, the careful, deliberate movement of them. Precise in a way that seemed disproportionate until she understood. It was how he kept something running in the right direction when everything else was moving wrong. What are you making? She asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was going to let the question go. Then, a horse. Daniel liked horses. She looked at the shape taking form under the knife. 4 legs emerging from the grain of the wood, rough but readable. The neck beginning to lift. He'd said it without guarding it first, which meant it had come out before the guard engaged. And because it was already out, he continued, not fluently, not with the ease of someone who tells stories about the people they've lost, in pieces. The way a person speaks about something that has been stored under pressure for a long time and comes out in fragments when the seal finally goes. Daniel had named every horse in the county he could get close enough to assess. Not random names, considered ones specific to each animal. The gray mare that Jake Merritt rode he'd called Duchess, and he'd called her that every single time he saw her, with the complete confidence of a child who believes that naming something makes it true. He'd told Merritt the horse's name as though Merritt simply hadn't known it yet. Merritt had thought it was funny. Rebecca had been embarrassed. Seth had thought he started differently. Seth had found it clarifying about the kind of person his son was going to become. The fever came 10 days after the relocation. The camp water was from a lower source, not the spring they'd used on Silver Creek. By the time anyone understood what was happening, Daniel had been sick for 3 days and was past the point where it could be managed with what they had available. He asked about the horses from his blankets on day 4, asked if the chestnut mare on the adjacent property he'd named her Copper was being taken care of. Seth had said yes. He didn't know if it was true, it was what Daniel needed to hear. He died on the 6th day. Rebecca didn't break during those 6 days. She was the one who managed each hour of them, the water, the cool cloths, the food Daniel couldn't eat, the vigil through the nights when Seth's own hands were shaking too badly to be useful. She was the steady one. After Seth kept waiting for her to come apart, the way he was coming apart, because he thought that was what happened after you'd held yourself together through something like that. He thought it was sequential. You held, and then you released, and then you rebuilt. She didn't release. She simply went quieter, and then quieter still. And then one morning 2 weeks after Daniel's grave was dug, she didn't wake up, and the examining man wrote fever in his ledger because there was no other category for it. And Seth had not corrected him because what would he have written instead? She didn't leave a note, Seth said. There wasn't anything she needed to say that I didn't already know. He looked at the wooden horse in his hands. I understood her completely by then, which was not a comfort and was also exactly a comfort. Both of those at once. May sat with that for a long moment. I used to think, she said carefully, that the worst thing was being the person something was done to. I've been revising that. She looked at her own hands. I think the hardest thing might be the loop. The mind that runs the same calculation over and over looking for a different answer and can't find one because there isn't one. Because it's not a problem. It's just what happened. Seth raised his eyes to her face. You didn't lose them because of something you failed to do, she said. Calhoun moved you off water you had a right to. What followed from that is his accounting, not yours. The loop doesn't reach a different answer because the variables in it are correct. You couldn't have changed the outcome from inside the situation you were in. She paused. That's not comfort. It's just what's true. He looked at her for a long time. The fire between them gave it small light and neither of them moved. You're the first person, he said at last, who said that without attaching something to the end of it. She didn't ask what he meant. She understood. The people who said things like that usually followed them with a turn toward the future, toward what came next, toward the part where it gets better. As though the acknowledgement were a doorway to be moved through rather than a place to stand in for a moment without hurrying. She let him stand in it. After a while he went back to the horse. She watched the shape of it emerge further from the wood and didn't say anything else, because some things don't need a response. They need to be witnessed and then allowed to continue. Ezra Finch arrived on a Thursday, coming in on the eastbound freight wagon rather than his usual solo mule. The roads had turned bad enough that even Finch, who had strong opinions about traveling alone, had made the practical accommodation. May found him at the stopping post outside the feed store, negotiating the unloading of his own equipment from the wagon bed with the focused efficiency of a man who does not delegate the handling of things that matter. He was older than his reputation suggested. Spare in the way that some men get when years and movement burn everything off except what's essential. His hands were quick and precise, the hands of someone who had spent decades turning messy human situations into formal language that would outlast the conversations that prompted them. Mr. Finch. She came up beside him and kept her voice down. Ruth Callaway sent word. He looked at her sideways. Went back a gear. She mentioned work. There is. What kind? Testimony. Names, dates, specific events. Written in language a territorial court examiner won't set aside. He lifted his leather case from the wagon, set it on the ground, straightened. I'm particular about what I put my name adjacent to, I know. Ruth told me. She met his eyes when he looked at her fully. Warren Calhoun owes you wages from a job in 1874. He told you the work was unsatisfactory. It wasn't he simply decided not to pay. Finch's expression didn't change outwardly, but something behind it did. People owe money for a lot of reasons. This particular debt may become collectible through legal proceedings. If someone presents a formal account of Calhoun's business practices to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver, she held his gaze. I have 2 witnesses willing to testify. Both saw things directly. I need someone to write it so it can't be dismissed as informal complaint. The pause that followed was shorter than she expected from a man who moved carefully. 3 copies, he said. 1 goes to Denver, 1 goes to Denver. 1 stays local with Ruth, 1 I keep, payment, 3 months of whatever work you need done when you pass through Red Rock Flats. And when Calhoun's legal situation becomes complicated, which the evidence suggests it will, you'll have standing to present the 1874 debt to whatever proceedings follow. Finch looked up the street. Down it. The assessment of a man doing arithmetic that wasn't only financial. Whatever he found at the end of it satisfied something. He picked up his leather case. Tonight. After dark, he went into the feed store without another word, which was, May understood, Ezra Finch's version of an enthusiastic agreement. The document took 2 evenings. Agnes came first. She sat across from Finch at Ruth's kitchen table and recited dates, times, and descriptions, and with the organized precision of someone who had been arranging this in her own head for longer than she'd had anywhere to put it. Finch wrote without commentary. He asked 4 clarifying questions. Agnes answered each without embellishment. She was not a woman who embellished. When the testimony was complete, she signed her name in letters that were larger and more deliberate than May expected, which said something specific about what it meant to Agnes to put her name to this particular truth. Thomas Reinhold came the second evening. Quiet man, built like his brother but carrying himself more carefully, with the measured movements of someone who has spent years being precise about what he says and where he says it. He'd been in Red Rock Flats when his brother's barn burned. He'd heard his brother's account of the lights from the South Bank before the family left the county. He'd carried that account for 8 months without a place to deliver it. He told it plainly. The direction of the lights south, not from the mountain. The organized movement of them too deliberate for a fire already spreading. His brother's certainty about the hat he'd recognized on one of the riders. The fact that he'd told this to Cole Dana the following morning and watched Dana write it down and close his book. Did Dana say anything when you told him? Finch asked. Thomas looked at the table. He said he'd look into it. He had the expression of a man who had already decided he wasn't going to. He raised his eyes. I know that expression. I've worn it myself when someone told me something I didn't want to act on. Finch nodded and wrote it down without judgment. When both testimonies were complete, Finch spent an hour organizing them into a single document with dates running in sequence, the pattern of incidents mapped against the dates of Calhoun's subsequent land acquisitions. Laid out that way, with Finch's precise handwriting making it formal and unavoidable, the correlation was not subtle. He sealed 1 copy himself, addressed it in block letters to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver. There's an eastbound freight wagon leaving day after tomorrow, he said, handing it to May. I'll put it on personally and confirm it's accepted. She took the sealed copy, held it for a moment. Thank you. Finch looked at her over his ink bottle. This is documentation, not resolution. Men like Calhoun have absorbed documentation before. He capped the ink with the particular care of a man who respects his materials. What makes it different this time is whether enough people are willing to be in the same room, saying the same thing at the same moment. He looked at her steadily. You understand that. I understand it. Good. He began packing his case. The 1874 debt, when the time comes, I'll need a formal filing. I know how to do that part. I know you do. He closed the case with a small, precise click and carried it out of Ruth's kitchen with the gait of a man who has recently become slightly less owed than he was. The night before they planned to move, May came back to the mine to find Seth sitting with the finished horse in his palm. She'd been running through the sequence in her head the whole climb up, who stood where, what came first, how to get through enough of the document before Dana moved. She came into the shaft with her mind still on the architecture of it, and nearly missed what was different. He was holding the horse the way you hold something complete. Not working it anymore. Turned it once in the firelight to check something, then set it down on the rock ledge beside him. 4 legs planted, neck up, facing the entrance of the mine. She sat down across from him, got her breath back from the climb. Finch put the Denver copy on the morning wagon, she said. It's gone. Agnes and Thomas Reinhold are both documented. 3 copies exist, and only one of them is in this county. She looked at him. Calhoun is going to find out something is coming. He doesn't know what yet, but men like that have calibrated instincts. He'll start feeling the edges of it soon. Seth looked at the horse on the ledge, which means we don't have the timeline we thought. No, She'd been working through this since she left Finch's meeting. Red Rock Flats has town hall every first Friday of the month. That's the one time you can guarantee Calhoun and Dana are both in a room with every other person in the county. She met his eyes. I stand up. I read the document. In front of all of them, Seth looked at her steadily. Dana will try to remove me the moment I start, she said. But if there are enough people in that room who've been waiting for a reason to stand up, and there are, I know this town then arresting me publicly confirms that there's something worth suppressing. It turns the act of silencing me into the evidence. And if Calhoun decides that calculation runs differently, Seth's voice was careful. If he decides the cost of you finishing is higher than the cost of the spectacle, that's why you're going to be there. He looked at her. The look went through several layers before it settled. She understood what she was asking. She was asking him to walk into the place that had made him into a story people told their children. To stand in front of the people who had been telling that story for 3 years. To give Cole Dana the clearest opportunity he'd ever had. I know what it costs, she said. I'm not pretending it doesn't. It's not the cost I'm weighing. He picked up the wooden horse from the ledge. A reflex she recognized now, something for his hands when his mind was working at full load. It's whether it changes anything real, or whether Calhoun has enough law in his pocket that we make noise and he absorbs it and continues. I can't promise he falls, she said directly. I can tell you that if we do nothing, the families along that creek lose their land permanently. Your name stays the reason given for everything he takes next. And Daniel and Rebecca disappear into the story Calhoun wrote about you instead of the true one. She held his gaze. I can also tell you that their names are in the document Finch wrote. What happened to them, the dates, the sequence from the removal to the contaminated water to what followed. That exists now regardless of what happens at Town Hall. That part is already done. The fire between them gave it small sound. Seth sat with what she'd said for a long time. She let him sit with it. This was not a moment to fill then. When is the Friday meeting? 4 days. He turned the horse once more in his hands. Set it back on the ledge in the same position facing out. 4 days is enough time. She almost said something about what that meant, what it cost him to say it. She stopped herself. He didn't need it named. He'd made his accounting and arrived at his answer, and naming it would only make him carry the weight of the naming on top of the weight of the thing. There's one more thing I need to do, she said, before Friday. I need to talk to Cole Dana. Seth looked at her sharply, not to warn him, not to negotiate. She met the look. Ruth told me something when I was there last. She said Dana has been writing things down, in his official log, events he observed and recorded and then let sit because acting on them wasn't safe for him. She paused. A man who keeps records he doesn't act on is a man who knows on some level that the day of reckoning is coming and wants to be on the right side of it when it does. Or he keeps records so he has leverage over Calhoun. Same instinct, different application. She shook her head. Either way, those records exist. And if he's been watching what I've been building this week, and a man like Dana watches everything, he may already be recalculating which direction is safer. She looked at the fire. I'm not asking him to be brave. I'm just going to let him see that the room is changing. Seth was quiet for a moment. And if he's not recalculating, if he goes straight to Calhoun with everything you've just told him, then we move the town hall meeting up to Wednesday and don't give Calhoun time to prepare. She met his eyes. I've thought about it. He looked at her with the expression that had become, over the past days, something she could read more fully, not soft exactly, but open in the specific way that open costs something. You've been thinking about all of this while you were climbing up here. I think better when I'm moving. She pulled her coat tighter. 3 years on that mountain, what did you think about? He was quiet for a moment. The same things over and over. He looked at the horse on the ledge. And then less about those things and more about the patterns on the rocks and the way the creek ran different after rain and what the clouds meant about tomorrow's weather. A pause. Somewhere in the 2nd year I noticed I'd stopped thinking about the things I couldn't change and started thinking about what was in front of me. Didn't decide to. Just happened. That's not nothing, she said. No, he looked at her. It's not nothing. The fire settled into its nighttime rhythm, outside the mine. The Colorado mountains were doing what they always did, holding their ground against the dark, with the complete indifference of things that have been doing it, long enough to have forgotten there was anything difficult about it. May watched the wooden horse on the ledge. The firelight moved across it, and the shadow of it moved on the rock behind, and it looked, in that light, like something that was just about to run. "When this is done," Seth said, without announcing that he was going to say something, "there's land north of the county line that's been sitting unworked for 2 seasons. Good soil. Clean water from a high source. Someone filed a claim on it and then didn't follow through." He was looking at the fire, not at her. "I've been watching it from the ridge." She waited. "I don't know what I'd do with 160 acres on my own." He said it the way he said things that were true and uncomfortable directly, without dressing. "I know how to work that kind of land. I know how to build on it. But building something alone," he stopped, started from a slightly different position. 3 years is long enough to know the difference between choosing to be alone and just being there because there was nowhere else. May looked at the fire. She thought about her grandmother's thimble in her coat pocket, about Ruth's kitchen, which had become something like ground under her feet in the past week, about what she'd said to Seth, about the loop that runs the same calculation looking for a different answer, and about what happened when the variables themselves changed. "Does it have south-facing ground?" she said. He looked at her. "For a garden, I'm particular about that. South-facing and sheltered enough from the late frost." She held his gaze. "I won't come as someone's arrangement. I want to say that plainly before we say anything else, I know that." His voice had something in it she was only now fully able to name. Not warmth exactly, something more specific. The sound of a man who means the thing he's about to say and has checked that twice before saying it. "I'm not looking for an arrangement. I'm looking for someone who argues with me about planting schedules." The corner of her mouth moved. "South-facing ground," he said. "And a kitchen window that faces east, because Rebecca always said morning light in a kitchen changed the whole character of it, and she was right about that." May held his gaze for a moment. "East is a reasonable starting position," he nodded once, put the wooden horse in his coat pocket. And for the first time in 3 years, Seth Callaway looked like a man who was planning to go somewhere, rather than a man who was simply enduring where he was. Outside, the mountain held its ground. Inside, 2 people sat with the specific quiet of those who have just agreed to something real, and let it be real without saying more about it than it needed. They came into Red Rock Flats from the north end on a Wednesday evening, 1 day earlier than anyone expected them, which was the point. The town was settling into supper hour. Smoke from cook fires rising straight in the cold air. The particular quiet of a place winding down toward dark. The dog that slept in front of the harness shop had moved to the alley beside it, curled against the wall where the day's warmth still held in the adobe. A boy crossing Main Street with an empty milk pail saw Seth first, stopped walking entirely, and then remembered somewhere he needed to be very quickly. May noticed that, the stopping and the quick remembering. The physics of a ghost story made solid the way the body responds to the impossible thing standing in plain sight. She kept walking. Seth kept walking beside her. His stride didn't adjust. The unhurried pace of a man who has finished making his decision and is no longer in negotiation with himself about it. She had the document inside her coat. 3 pages in Finch's careful hand. The evidence sequenced so the dates and land records came first, and the personal testimony followed. She'd spent the previous night going over the order again, not the content, which she knew completely, but the architecture of persuasion. You gave people the pattern before you asked them to believe the witnesses. You let the numbers establish the shape before you named who made it. They reached Ruth's back door at 6:15. Ruth was there. Agnes too. May hadn't expected Agnes. But Agnes was standing at Ruth's kitchen table with her coat on and her hands folded, and the expression of a woman who has made a decision and arrived early, because arriving early is what you do when you've decided. "He fired me last night." Agnes said it before May had fully cleared the doorway. No preamble, no softening. "Around 9 o'clock. Gave me a week's wages in an envelope and told me my services were no longer required." She met May's eyes. He doesn't know what's coming, but he knows something is. He's cutting loose anything that might complicate his position. May felt the timeline compress in her chest. Did he say anything specific? He said I should consider leaving the county. Agnes's chin came up a fraction. He said it gently, which was more instructive than if he'd said it another way. Ruth set coffee on the table. The smell of it in the early kitchen was the most ordinary thing May had encountered in a week, and she let it anchor her for a moment, the specific gravity of something familiar when everything else was moving. Town hall meets at 7, May said. 50 minutes. People start gathering at 6:30, Ruth said. Calhoun will already be positioned. He comes early to town hall, it's where he reminds the room who holds it. She looked at Seth, the first time she'd looked at him fully since they came in. She knew him the way she knew most things in this county, not personally, but by shape and consequence. You look better than the circumstances suggest. Seth accepted this without ceremony. May does adequate work. Ruth's mouth made a movement that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same territory. She learned from someone with high standards. She turned back to the practical. Cole Danner has been at the deputy's office since this afternoon. He started stationing himself at the town hall entrance about a year ago. He frames it as courtesy. We come in through the east, May said. Fire door on the east wall. The volunteer brigade uses it, no one else does. It opens from outside if you know where to push. Ruth met May's eyes. Calhoun never watches that wall. It's never been relevant, May nodded. Turned to Agnes. When I start reading, I'm going to need people in that room who aren't hearing this cold. Not brief, just not surprised. Ben Pearson is at the boarding house, Ruth said. He's been there since he signed the land over. Wouldn't leave the county. I'll send word through the kitchen boy right now. She was already moving. And Thomas Reinhold, he works late at the livery on Wednesdays. I know which alley he cuts through. 15 minutes, May said. Ruth was gone before she finished saying it. Agnes looked at May across the table. I'm going to stand up with you. May started to speak. He fired me yesterday, Agnes said, before May could find the objection. He told me to leave. The worst thing he had available to do to me, he's already done. She looked at her hands, those work-roughened hands that had spent 15 years being invisible. I've been watching from the furniture long enough. I'd like to be a person in a room for once. May held her gaze. Then she nodded. Because Agnes was right in arguing with the right person costs time you don't have. Seth was at the kitchen window, watching the street in the way he watched things, not tense, just receiving everything available. He turned. How many of Calhoun's men are typically in town on a Wednesday? 2 ride in for supplies most weeks, Ruth called from the back room. Sometimes 3. They're not hired for their gun work. They're hired to be seen, presence as argument, Seth said quietly, not to anyone in particular. Organizing his own thinking, which May had learned he did rarely enough that it was worth listening to when it happened. The problem is Danner, May said. Calhoun's men have no legal authority inside a public meeting. Danner does. He'll try to remove me the moment I start reading. And if he does it before I've gotten through enough of the document, the room won't have the information it needs to make a decision about what it's watching. Then you need to get through enough of it fast, Seth said, which is why the order matters. She put her hand on the document inside her coat, feeling the folded edges of it. Land records first, dates. The correlation between incidents and Calhoun's subsequent acquisitions. By the time I get to the testimony, the pattern is already in the room. Even if Danner stops me after that, the room has the arithmetic. Seth looked at her steadily. And if Calhoun decides the arithmetic is worth more than the spectacle of stopping you publicly, then he tries to have Danner remove me in front of everyone, which confirms that something in that document is worth suppressing. She met his eyes. Either way, we're ahead of where we were yesterday. He was quiet for a moment. You've been building this sequence since the mine. I think better when I'm moving, she said. Which was the same thing she'd told him the night before and was still true. Are you ready? He put his hand in his coat pocket. She knew without seeing it that his fingers had closed around the wooden horse. Yes, Ruth came back into the kitchen. Word is sent. Pearson will be in the 4th row right side before 7. Thomas Reinhold is coming directly from the livery. She looked at the clock on the shelf. 20 minutes. May picked up her coffee and finished it in 2 swallows. Set the cup down. Looked at Agnes, at Seth, at Ruth. East door, she said. I go first. Seth comes in through the main entrance 30 seconds after I start reading. Agnes, you come in behind me through the east and take the 3rd row right. When the time comes, you stand. Don't speak unless someone addresses you directly. Agnes nodded once. They went out into the cold Colorado evening and walked toward the lights of Town Hall. The building was 3/4 full by the time May reached the east wall. She could see it through the gap where the fire door sat a half-inch off its frame, the warm lamplight inside, the rows of benches filling, the particular social arrangement of a small town that knows its own geography. Families she'd grown up watching, men she could name from 50 yards. The specific texture of a community that has been told what to be afraid of and has organized itself around that telling. Warren Calhoun sat left side, 3 rows back. Not the front row that would have been obvious, but close enough that the room oriented toward him without being told to. He was speaking to the man beside him with the relaxed attention of someone who considers the evening's proceedings a formality preceding the outcome he's already arranged. 2 of his ranch hands stood along the west wall in the flat-brimmed hats that functioned as his signature at a distance. Cole Danner was at the main entrance, as Ruth had said. Badge visible. Weight forward slightly on the balls of his feet. The posture of a man who has been given a function and is performing it. Ben Pearson was in the 4th row right, exactly where Ruth's message had placed him. Broad-shouldered, beard going grey faster than his hair. He sat the way a man sits when he's made up his mind to stay in a seat regardless of what comes at him. Thomas Reinhold had taken a position near the east wall itself, 6 rows back. He'd come straight from the livery, still had the specific smell of that work on him. May knew from when she'd passed him outside. He'd nodded at her without speaking, which said everything about what he understood he was here to do. Agnes was behind May, 2 steps back. Waiting, May put her hand flat against the fire door and pushed. The door opened without drama. She walked in. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It never does. It goes quiet the way a fire goes out from the edges first, where people notice the thing happening and stop what they're doing to watch it, and then spreading inward until the center catches up and the whole room is doing the same thing. 4 seconds, maybe 5. May walked up the center aisle. Pace even. Hands at her sides, the document in her right hand. She did not look at Calhoun. She looked at the platform at the front of the room where the county recorder usually stood, and she walked toward it and she stepped up onto it. Arvin, the county recorder, had the expression of a man who had been surprised by his own job for 15 years and had not yet made peace with it. He started to stand. Ruth Callaway's voice came from the 3rd row left before he got upright. "Sit down, Arvin. Let her speak." Arvin sat down. Danner had begun moving up the right aisle. Not running, he wasn't careless enough for that. Walking with the deliberate pace of official purpose, which was its own kind of pressure. And then the main entrance opened. And Seth Callaway walked in. The second wave of quiet was different from the first. The first had been the attention you give to something unexpected. This was the attention you give to something that has reorganized the available space. He was simply what he was, the full scale of him, present and unhurried, standing just inside the door with his hands at his sides, and his eyes moving through the room with the steady assessment of a man who has spent 3 years keeping himself alive through accurate observation. Not threatening, not performing, just there, unavoidably, undeniably there. Danner stopped moving. Not completely. His feet kept their position, but his forward momentum ceased. The visible hesitation of a man whose calculation has just been revised mid-step. He looked at Seth, looked at the room, looked at Calhoun. Calhoun's expression didn't change, but his hands, May noticed, closed on his knees. She opened the document. "My name is May Eleanor Briggs," she said, not loud. The room was giving her everything it had. "I've lived in this county my whole life, and most of you know that. I have something to put in front of you that belongs to all of you, and I'm going to put it there now." Calhoun's voice came from the 3rd row, measured as a man reading figures. "This is not the established process for town hall business, Miss Briggs. There are procedures." November 4th, May said. Pearson outbuilding fire. November 6th, 2 days later, Calhoun Land Office records show preliminary inquiry into acquiring Pearson water rights. She looked up briefly, back to the page. December 17th. Kellerman fence line, North River branch, 3 sections destroyed, cattle scattered. December 19th, Kellerman informs the county recorder of intention to vacate the property. She paused. Let that sit. 2 days, the same interval. January 9th, Reinhold barn, North branch, total loss. January 11th. Calhoun files a formal expression of interest in acquiring the Reinhold water claim. She looked up at the room. Each time something happened on the river properties, Warren Calhoun was in a position to acquire something within 48 hours. 3 incidents, 3 acquisitions. The same 2-day gap each time. The sound that moved through the room was not dramatic. It was the sound of people doing arithmetic they'd been given the pieces of before but hadn't been handed the complete equation. Furthermore, May continued, on 3 separate nights prior to each of these incidents, witnesses observed men departing the Calhoun Ranch property after midnight in civilian clothing and carrying torches. Not from the mountain, not from Boulder Break, she found Agnes with her eyes briefly, from the south. From the direction of the Calhoun South pasture, Calhoun rose, unhurried. The controlled rise of a man who has taken rooms before and knows that the first thing is to take the air out of the space. What this young woman is describing is the invention of a grievance. Her family owed me a legitimate debt. She was asked to leave the county. She is here because she has a personal interest in attacking my reputation, and she is using the name of a man who was killed. The witnesses who observed those departures, May said, cutting through cleanly, have provided sworn testimony to a licensed clerk. Their accounts have been recorded formally. 3 copies exist. One was delivered to the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver 4 days ago. The room went to a different quality of silence. Dana had not resumed moving. He stood in the right aisle with his hand near his badge and the specific stillness of a man waiting for instructions because his own procedures had run out of road. Cole. Calhoun's voice had not changed in volume or register, but something in it had shifted the difference between a request and a reminder of what the request implied. Remove her from the platform. Dana looked at the room. He looked at Ruth Callaway standing in the 3rd row left. At Ben Pearson standing in the 4th row, right. Pearson had come to his feet without May seeing it happen, simply standing now with the quiet inevitability of a large man who has decided where he is. At Thomas Reinhold near the east wall, upright and still. At Agnes Pike in the 3rd row right, who had stood at some point in the past 30 seconds, and was standing now with the 2 extra inches of a woman who has been sitting down for 15 years and found something in getting up that she hadn't expected. Other people were standing. Not all of them, not even most of them. But enough, the specific threshold of enough where remaining seated starts to feel like a declaration rather than a neutral position. Dana looked back at Calhoun. I'm not going to do that, Warren. His voice came out rougher than usual. The roughness of a muscle exercised for the first time in a long while. Not in front of all of this. The room heard it. Every person in it heard those 7 words and understood what they meant, not just the refusal but the name. Warren, not Mr. Calhoun, not Sir, the name of someone being addressed as an equal by a man who had not addressed him as an equal in several years. Calhoun's face did not change, but his hands opened on his knees and closed again. May looked at Seth across the room. He was still at the entrance, not having moved from where he'd entered. He looked back at her with the expression she could now read fully open, at cost holding. She found the 3rd page of the document. Seth Callaway and his family were removed from their property at the upper reach of Silver Creek on October 9, 1875, she said. The removal was initiated by a petition to the Territorial Land Office citing military land reorganization. That petition was signed by 1 party. She looked at the room. Warren Calhoun. The room held its breath. Following removal, the Callaway family was placed in a government-organized camp 12 miles east. The camp's water source was a lower draw, not the spring they had used on Silver Creek. It was contaminated. She found the names on the page. She had promised herself she would read them clearly, and she read them clearly. Daniel Callaway, 4 years old. Died of typhoid fever November 2, 1875. Rebecca Callaway. Died November 14, 1875. The examining man recorded the cause as fever. She paused. It was not fever. It was what happens to a person when they have been removed from every reason they had to continue. Which is something you can do to a person without ever touching them. And which is Warren Calhoun's accounting, not Seth Callaway's. Total silence, the kind of silence a room earns. The kind that only comes when the thing being said is landing in the specific place where people who have been pretending not to know something are finally given permission to stop the pretending. Seth walked up the center aisle. He walked the same way May had pace even, nothing performed, and stopped at the front of the room below the platform and turned to face the people rather than the platform. His voice was low. It filled the room without effort. I defended myself 3 times against men who came to me armed and with purpose. I did not come down from that mountain for 3 years because I had nothing left that required me to be anywhere. My family was gone. The land was gone. and the men Calhoun sent up were not sent to bring me in. He looked at the room, at the people, not at Calhoun. They were sent to make certain I never stood in a room like this one and said what I'm saying now. A beat. Deliberate. I'm saying it now. And Warren Calhoun used the names of my wife and my son as the reason people should be afraid, while he used that fear to take their land. That is the true accounting of what has happened in this county. The silence held for another moment. Then Calhoun moved to offense because it was the only remaining option. This man has killed. That fact stands regardless of what anyone reads aloud. The reward I posted is lawful and it stands. Cole, I already told you, Dana's voice, still from the aisle, was steadier this time. I'm not doing that tonight. Calhoun looked at him. The look of a man who is recalibrating a resource he thought he controlled. You work for this county, Cole. You have an obligation. I work for this county, Dana said. Not for you, he straightened slightly. And I think there are people in this room who've been waiting to hear someone say that for a while. Several people sat down. Several more stood up. The room was in motion now. The specific motion of a collective thing rearranging its understanding of itself. And Calhoun was watching it happen with the face of a man who has felt the ground shift under a structure he built and is calculating how much of it is going to hold. The answer was becoming visible, and it was not the answer he'd spent 12 years constructing. May folded the document, put it back inside her coat, stepped down from the platform. What came after was not orderly. It was never going to be orderly. The room broke along the lines that rooms break along when a collective understanding has just been revised. People needed to test the new version against their own experience, against the things they'd noticed and set aside, against the small inconsistencies they'd explained away because explaining away was easier than what the alternative required. May heard it in fragments as she came down from the platform. Voices she recognized running through the dates, comparing them to what they remembered about when Calhoun had shown up at certain properties. A woman in the second row saying to the woman beside her that she'd always thought the timing was strange. Ben Pearson. Still on his feet, speaking to Thomas Reinhold in a low voice with the specific intensity of two men who have been holding the same information separately and are now discovering they can put it together. Calhoun had not left. May noticed that particularly. He was still in his seat, speaking to the man beside him with controlled quiet, and the fact that he hadn't left meant he was still calculating, still looking for the version of this evening where he recovered the room, which meant he was not yet finished. She was watching him across the moving crowd when Cole Dana came to her. He stopped 2 feet away, badge still on. Hands at his sides in the deliberate posture of a man communicating that he's not a threat by the position of his own body. He looked like someone who had recently put something down that had been heavy. The testimony in Denver, he said, on the morning wagon 4 days ago, already received and logged, if the timing held. He looked at the floor briefly. I have a log, he said, my official log. Events I observed and recorded over the past 14 months. Things I wrote down and then, he stopped. Things I wrote down and let sit. She looked at him steadily. Because acting on them wasn't safe. Because acting on them wasn't, he stopped again. Tried a different entry. I've been keeping those records because I knew, somewhere in the back of it, that the day was going to come when they'd matter. I told myself it was professional diligence. His jaw worked. It wasn't entirely that. What else was it? Insurance, he said. Flat, honest. Insurance against the day Calhoun decided I'd become more expensive than useful. He raised his eyes to hers. And because some part of me that I mostly managed to ignore knew that what I was participating in was, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I'd like to give that log to whoever comes from Denver, along with 3 separate records of payments I received from Calhoun's land office, which I also kept. May held his gaze for a long moment. He was not a good man who had been corrupted. He was a man who had made a calculation a long time ago and had been living inside that calculation ever since. And tonight the calculation had finally stopped being viable. That was different from redemption. But it produced something practically useful, which was what the situation required. Keep them safe between now and when the marshal's office responds to the Denver filing, she said. Don't let anything happen to them. He nodded. Once. And walked back toward the entrance. Agnes found May beside the east wall. She had the expression of someone who has just set down something they've been carrying for a long time and is still feeling the phantom weight of it. He's going to work the room tonight, she said quietly. He'll call in what he's owed. There are people here who owe him money, people who've benefited from his goodwill, people who are frightened of what happens if his version of this recovers. She glanced toward where Calhoun was still seated, still working his quiet calculation. Don't assume tonight is the resolution. I don't, May said. Good, Agnes looked at her hands, then back at May. You read their names clearly. May held that for a moment. Yes, Daniel and Rebecca. Agnes said the names the way she said most things quietly, but with something underneath that didn't move. I heard Calhoun talk about the 1875 removal once. He was pleased with himself about it. He used the word nuisance. Her jaw tightened for the first time May had seen it tighten. I have thought about that word for 3 years. I'm glad their names are now in a document that exists in Denver. Seth came to stand beside May. Not close. The distance of someone who understood the room was still in motion, and this was not the moment to make anything about the two of them. He looked at what was left of the evening, Calhoun still working his quiet counter-moves, people talking in clusters, Dana at the entrance doing something complicated with his conscience, and he said nothing, which was also something. May looked at the room. Calhoun was still there, still calculating. Still the man who had been running this county for 12 years and had not yet accepted that the machinery of it had broken. She was not naive about what that meant for the days ahead, but the document was in Denver. The witnesses had spoken in front of 200 people. Dana had said 7 words in a room full of people who would remember them. And those 3 things, taken together, had changed the shape of something that could not be fully changed back. That was enough for tonight. Tonight, that was enough. What Calhoun did in the following days was exactly what Agnes had predicted, and Agnes had predicted accurately, because 15 years of invisibility was 15 years of watching how a man operated when he thought no one was tallying. He visited 4 families that first evening after the town hall had emptied, sat in parlors with the ease of a man who had sat in those parlors before, and made himself comfortable there, and reminded people of what he was owed and what the process of collecting it might look like if relationships became complicated. 2 of those families had stood up during the meeting. One of them stood again the following morning when his man came by the standing, having become, overnight, less frightening than the alternative. One did not, which was the cost of the arithmetic being different for people with different margins. He put it about through 3 separate intermediaries that May had manufactured her case from personal grievance, that the Briggs family debt was the source of it, that a girl with nothing to lose was a girl with nothing to lose and therefore nothing credible to offer. This landed with some people and didn't land with others. And the line between those groups turned out to correspond fairly closely to the line between people who had personally dealt with Calhoun and people who had only heard about him from people who had. On Friday morning, 2 days after the town hall, Henry Briggs appeared at Ruth's back door. May saw him from the kitchen window before he knocked. He stood outside the door for a full minute first with his hat in his hands and the posture of a man preparing himself for something he'd been putting off. He looked older than he had 10 days ago. Not in the way of time passing, but in the way of something internal having shifted under the weight of things. She opened the door. He didn't come in immediately. He stood on the step with the hat, turning in his hands and his eyes going to the kitchen behind her, and then back to her face. I heard what you said, he managed, in that meeting. I wasn't there. I heard from Caleb Merritt, who was. He looked down at the hat. About the debt, about why he stopped. You don't need to explain it to me again, May said. I understood it the morning it happened. He looked up. That doesn't make it. No, she said. It doesn't. She leaned against the doorframe. But I'm not going to stand here and let you give me an accounting of something I was present for. I know what happened, Papa. I know why you did it. She held his gaze. And I know it wasn't only the debt. It was 12 years of being afraid of him. And one morning the fear got larger than everything else. Including me. A pause. That's the truth of it, and both of us already know it, so you don't have to say it and I don't have to hear it. Henry's jaw worked. His eyes had gone red at the rims again, and this time she didn't wonder about the cause. Your mother is asking for you. Since that morning she hasn't. He couldn't organize the sentence. She's not herself. May was quiet for a moment. She looked past him at the cold morning, at the yard behind Ruth's house, where the frost was still on the dead grass. She thought about her grandmother's thimble in her coat pocket, which she had been carrying every day since she left that house, which was the only thing she'd asked for and the only thing that had come with her unasked. "I'll come by," she said. "Not today. In a day or two," he nodded. Turned the hat over once more in his hands. "May, go home, Papa." She said it without heat, without the anger she'd expected to find still sitting there. The anger had been useful when it needed to be useful and had spent itself on something that mattered, and what was left was something quieter and more permanent. Look after Dorothy. And when this is over, when Calhoun's situation is resolved and you're not under his pressure anymore, we'll figure out what the land situation looks like and whether there's anything to be done about it. He stared at her. "You do that?" "I'm not doing it for the debt," she said. "I'm doing it because that land was there before he was, and it should still be there after." She straightened. "And because you are my father, for better and worse. And that doesn't stop being true because of one morning." Henry Briggs put his hat back on his head and walked away across the yard with a slightly different quality to his gait than when he'd arrived, not lighter exactly, but as if something had been correctly named and the naming of it had allowed him to carry it differently. May closed the door, stood in Ruth's kitchen for a moment with her hand still on the latch. Then she went to find Seth, because there was still work to do, and the work was what mattered now. She found him in the yard, splitting wood. Ruth had asked him to deal with a practical job that needed doing and which he'd apparently identified and begun without being asked, which she noted as characteristic of how he operated when he was somewhere he considered himself to have some responsibility for. He was good at it in the specific way of someone who had spent years doing physical work alone, each movement economical. No wasted motion. He looked up when she came out. Read her face in the way he'd developed for reading her face. "Your father? Yes. How is it?" She thought about that honestly. Not resolved, but named. Which is a different thing, and sometimes it's enough. He nodded, set the axe down and picked up the split pieces and stacked them against the wall in the organized way he did everything physical. "Dana's log," he said. "He's keeping it safe. Waiting for Denver to respond. How long?" "Ruth thinks within the week, given what we sent." Finch wrote to the marshal's office directly as well, his own letter, separate from the testimony documents. He has contacts there from previous work. She came and sat on the chopping block, which was broad enough to serve as a seat. Calhoun's been working the families. One held and one didn't. Which one didn't? The Aldriches. New to the county, mortgaged property, 3 children under 10. She looked at her hands. They can't afford the same price that people with less to lose can afford. That's not cowardice, that's arithmetic. Seth sat on the woodpile across from her. "What does it mean for the case?" "Finch says we don't need the Aldriches. What we have from Agnes and Thomas Reinhold is direct observation. What we have from Dana is official records and payment receipts." She met his eyes. "It's enough. It was enough in the document we sent to Denver. Calhoun working the families is him trying to erode the public pressure, not the legal substance." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the yard, at the frost that hadn't lifted yet even though it was past mid-morning. "And you," he said. "After this, when it's resolved, whatever resolved looks like, I've been thinking about that, and..." She looked at him directly. "South-facing ground," she said. "And I want to see the water source before we commit to anything. I won't build on a creek I haven't assessed." He held her gaze, the expression she'd come to know open at cost, checking the thing twice before saying it. "The creek runs clean," he said. "I've been watching it from the ridge for 2 seasons. High source, granite bed, no lower draws contaminating it. I'll judge that for myself when I see it. I expected that." "Good." She stood up. "Then we wait for Denver. And in the meantime, there's a garden plan I want to work out. Because if we're going to break ground in spring, I need to know the frost dates for that elevation, and I need to know them before we leave this county." Seth looked at her. Something in his face was doing the thing it did, the thing that had the architecture of a smile, and kept approaching it from a new direction each time. "Ruth will know the frost dates. Ruth will know the frost dates," May agreed. "She knows everything before you ask." And for the first time in 10 days, something in her chest that had been running at full tension eased a fraction. Not because it was over, because the direction was clear, and the direction was forward, and she had a place to put herself in it. U.S. Marshal Frank Aldridge arrived in Red Rock Flats on a Thursday 6 days after the town hall meeting, which was faster than May had allowed herself to expect. Not a deputy, not a letter, the marshal himself, which communicated something specific about what the Denver office had concluded from Finch's documentation. He came in on the morning coach with 2 deputies and a leather satchel that had the weight of a great deal of paperwork in it, and he checked into the boarding house and began his interviews before noon. He was a rangy man in his middle 50s with a gray mustache maintained with precision and the particular quality of movement that comes from spending a career in rooms where accurate reading of people was survival rather than preference, he said. Little that wasn't a question. He wrote down the answers to his questions with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this many times and understood that the time for conclusions came after the evidence was complete and not before. He met with the county recorder first, then with Agnes, who sat across from him in Ruth's kitchen with her hands folded on the table, and gave her account for the 3rd time with the same organized clarity she'd given it the first, because the truth doesn't require management between tellings. Aldridge asked her 7 questions. She answered each one without elaboration. When he was finished, he looked at her steadily for a moment and then said, "Thank you, Miss Pike," which was a thing she had apparently not been told often enough that she received it without reaction. He met with Thomas Reinhold at the livery, where Thomas didn't need to go anywhere or perform anything because he simply told again what he had seen: the lights from the south, the direction wrong for the mountain, the deliberate movement of them. Dana recording it and closing his book. He reviewed Dana's log in the deputy's office with Dana present, which was a meeting that lasted 2 hours, and from which Dana emerged looking like a man who had put down a weight and was working out what his posture was without it. Then Aldridge asked to meet Seth. May came with him. Not because Seth required it. He'd walked into a room of 200 people 6 days ago and said what he had to say, but because she'd built this thing piece by piece and she intended to be present when the last piece was placed. They met in the shed at the back of Ruth's property, which had become, over the past week, a kind of working headquarters for everything that needed to happen outside of Ruth's kitchen. The shed smelled of cut wood and old leather and cold air. A lantern hung from the center hook. 3 people in a small space, Aldridge in the chair Ruth had carried out, Seth and May on the workbench. Aldridge opened his satchel. Seth Callaway. He said the name the way a man says a name he's been reading in documents for a week and is now checking against the person the documents describe. I've read everything Miss Briggs sent through Mr. Finch. I've spoken with the witnesses. I have Dana's records and 3 separate payment documents linking Calhoun's land office directly to Dana's account. He set his pen on the satchel. I have enough to proceed formally, but I want to hear your account directly. Seth gave it. Methodically, without embellishment, in the same sequence he'd given it to May in the cabin 10 days ago, the 3 years on Boulder Break. The pattern of Dana's visits, the 3 separate incidents of self-defense, the men who came armed with orders rather than with legal authority. He gave dates where he had them and approximations where he didn't, and was clear about which was which. Aldridge listened without interrupting, wrote steadily. At the end he asked 4 questions, all of them specific, all of them aimed at the points where the defense of Calhoun's actions would try to create doubt. Seth answered each one precisely. When the questions were done, Aldridge set his pen down. The petition Calhoun filed in 1875 to initiate your removal from Silver Creek, he said. The territorial examiner we sent ahead of my arrival has reviewed that petition. The military land reorganization cited in it did not exist. The petition was fabricated. The reorganization order it references was issued for a different district and a different year, and was altered. He met Seth's eyes with the directness of a man delivering a verdict. Your removal was unlawful. The land at Silver Creek was sold in the year following your removal, and the transactions subsequent to that are complicated to unwind legally. But the territorial court has authority to award compensatory damages for wrongful removal under false pretense, and the examiner's finding supports that claim. Seth said nothing for a moment. Then, the families along the creek, Pearson, Kellerman, Reinhold, Pearson's water rights are being restored. That process begins next week. Kellerman filed a formal reclamation through the county recorder's office this morning. I saw that paperwork before I came here. Aldridge paused. Reinhold is more complicated because he left the county and will need to file in person. But the path is open and the examiner's finding supports his claim as strongly as any of the others. And Calhoun, Aldridge's expression did not shift, but the quality of what he said next was precise in the way of a man being careful about what he confirms and what he doesn't. Warren Calhoun will be asked to answer formal charges of land fraud and conspiracy to deprive lawful settlers of property rights through manufactured threat. Dana will face charges for misconduct in office, reduced in exchange for his full cooperation, which has been complete. A pause. Calhoun's lawyers are already in communication with my office. Men with resources have options in legal proceedings that men without resources don't have. I won't misrepresent that to you, he looked at Seth steadily. But his operation in this county is finished. His land holdings are under review by the territorial assessor. The families along that creek will not lose what remains of their claims. And your name, he stopped. Chose the next words carefully. Your name will not be attached to anything that happened in this county except the account you just gave me, which is the account that will be in the record. Seth looked at the lantern. The lantern gave its even light. Outside the shed, Red Rock Flats was going about its Thursday business, the ordinary sounds of a town that had been changed by a week's events, and was working out what the change meant for the day-to-day of it. Seth nodded once. The nod of a man receiving something true and letting it settle where it needed to settle, rather than reaching for it or pushing it away. One more thing, Aldridge said. He reached into the satchel and produced a single folded document, set it on the workbench between them. Your status as a free man in this territory has always been legally intact. You were never formally charged with anything, Dana having declined to file charges on each of the 3 incidents. This, he touched the document, is the examiner's finding on the 1875 removal. It's yours to keep. It says in official language with the territorial seal that what was done to your family was unlawful. He met Seth's eyes. Sometimes that matters. Sometimes people need to have it in writing. Seth picked up the document, looked at it for a moment, folded it again along its existing creases and put it inside his coat. Aldridge stood, picked up his satchel, looked at May, Miss Briggs. What you built here was comprehensive. The sequencing of the evidence, the witnesses you secured, the formal documentation that's not a common quality in a circumstance like this one. He said it without sentiment, the way he said everything as assessment, not praise. This county will be the better for it. He went out into the afternoon. May and Seth sat in the shed for a moment, in the particular quiet of people who have just watched something finish that they'd been building toward for 10 days. Not the dramatic quiet of completion. The more specific quiet of a thing that was real being confirmed as real. Seth took the folded document back out of his coat, held it in both hands. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. This was his moment and it needed to be his without anyone managing it. After a while he said very quietly, Daniel and Rebecca Callaway in writing, with a seal. Yes, he put it back. Sat with his hands on his knees in the way he sat when his hands didn't have something necessary to do with themselves. I want to go to Silver Creek, he said. Before we leave the county, I want to stand there once. Yes, she said again. That was all that needed to be said about it. That evening, Calhoun was served with formal notice of charges at his ranch property by one of Aldridge's deputies. The deputy reported that Calhoun received the documents without visible response, which people who knew Calhoun said was characteristic, and which people who knew what the documents contained understood was not the same thing as the absence of response. By the following morning, word had moved through Red Rock Flats the way word always moved in a small town, faster than anyone planned and reaching everyone before noon. And the particular shape of the word this time was different from the shape it had taken for 12 years, because this time it was not Calhoun's word. It was the territorial examiner's. It was the U.S. Marshals. It was Dana's records and Agnes Pike's sworn testimony, and Thomas Reinhold standing in a room and saying what his brother had seen. And it was May Briggs on a platform with a document, reading names clearly. They walked to Silver Creek the next morning. Cold, clear, the mountains showing their full scale in the winter light. The creek was partly iced at the edges, where the current slowed dark water moving under a skin of frost, granite bed visible through it in the clear places. The grass on the bank was winter flat, but the soil beneath, when May pressed her boot into it, was deep and dark and gave in the way of ground that has been fed by clean water for longer than anyone has been counting. She stood beside Seth at the creek's edge and he was quiet for a long time, and she let him be quiet because this required it. He took the wooden horse from his coat pocket, set it on the flat rock at the water's edge. 4 legs planted on the granite, neck lifted, facing the current. She looked at it there on the stone, the rough work of it. The way the firelight in the mine had moved across it and made it look like something about to run, and the way it looked now in the open winter light, still, but present. Left somewhere specific on purpose. He didn't pick it up again. He left it on the stone. She understood that. This was the right place for it, not the mine. Here, where the water was clean and the light was clear, and Daniel would have been standing at this bank thinking of names. He would have called the creek something, Seth said. He would have decided it had a name and told everyone what it was and expected them to use it. What would he have named it? Seth looked at the water for a long moment. Something that sounded important. He was for important sounding was the primary criterion. The corner of his mouth moved in that way it had. Swift, probably, or Arrow. He liked the sound of Arrow. Arrow Creek, May said. He would have announced it at supper. As a fact, the creek is called Arrow Creek, and that is settled. Seth's voice had the specific quality of someone speaking about something that hurts, and is also, irreducibly, something they love. Both of those at once, as he'd said, and neither one cancelling out the other. She stood beside him and didn't say anything for a while. The water moved. The horse on the stone faced it. The mountains above Arrow Creek, which was what it was called now, as far as May was concerned, and she intended to use that name, held their position against the winter sky, with the complete patience of things that have been there long enough to know they'll still be there after. The land north, Seth said. We should go look at it before the ground freezes harder. There are things I want your assessment of before we decide. She looked at him. My assessment, the soil, the water, the slope toward the south. He met her eyes. You said you'd judge the creek for yourself. I want you to judge all of it for yourself, because we're not breaking ground on something you haven't approved. She held his gaze. That's the most words you've said at once since I met you. It seemed like the situation required them. She looked back at the creek, at the wooden horse on the stone, which she was going to leave there, because this was where it belonged, and Seth had known that when he set it down, and she knew it too. Spring, she said. We break ground in spring. I'll need the frost date for that elevation, and I'll need to know whether the south slope catches enough light for the longer season crops. It does. I'll judge that for myself. I know you will. East-facing kitchen window, she said. Already planned for it. She looked at him sideways. You've been planning this since Boulder Break. I've been looking at that land for 2 years, he said. I just didn't have a reason to do anything about it until recently. He held her gaze with the specific openness that cost him something, each time, and that he offered anyway. I have a reason now, May Eleanor Briggs. 20 years old, standing at the edge of a creek in the Colorado mountains in the winter of 1879, with a document sewn into the record of a territorial court and a horse carved from mine wood on a granite stone, and a man beside her who had come down from the mountain because she'd given him a reason to. She felt the full weight of the past 10 days settle and then ease. Not resolve into something simple. Nothing that mattered was simple, but ease into the shape it was going to have, which was a shape she'd chosen rather than one she'd been given. She was not the girl who'd walked out a gate 10 days ago, with a flour sack bundle and nowhere to be. She was not the woman who would have been if she'd kept walking north and left a wounded man to the rocks. She was something that had been built in the interval between those two things, from decisions she'd made one at a time, and it was hers in a way that nothing had been hers before. Spring, she said again. We'll need seed for the first garden before the ground breaks. I have opinions about what goes in first. I expected that too, Seth said. And they stood at Arrow Creek a while longer, in the cold, clear winter light, with the wooden horse facing the current and the mountains holding their ground above them, and eventually they turned and walked north toward what came next. Not away from anything, toward. That was the difference. And the difference was everything. 1 year later, in a house that faced the right direction and had a kitchen window that caught the morning precisely as Rebecca had always said, a kitchen window should. May stood at that window with her hands around a coffee cup and watched Seth at the fence line below, working with the particular focused economy of a man who has found a use for his hands that means something. She was expecting their first child in the spring. They had talked about names with the care of people who understood that names carry weight, who knew from experience what it meant to have a name said clearly in a room, and what it meant to have a name carved into wood and left on a stone in clean water. If a girl, Rebecca. If a boy, Daniel, not to replace. Not to pretend the loss was anything other than what it was. But because the people who are gone deserve to have their names spoken in new contexts, in living rooms, on ordinary mornings, said by a child who is learning what their name means and finding it means something good. Outside, Seth looked up from the fence line, looked at the window, at her, raised one hand briefly in the uncomplicated gesture of a man acknowledging that someone he cares about is where he can see them. She raised hers back. Arrow Creek ran clean below the house. The south-facing garden was planned out in May's handwriting on a piece of paper pinned to the kitchen wall's spring crops, marked in order of planting date, frost dates accounted for, the longer season crops positioned on the slope that caught the best light. Outside the window, the Colorado mountains were doing what they always did, which was to hold their position against whatever the sky decided to throw at them, patient and permanent and entirely unimpressed by the difficulty of any of it. May finished her coffee. There was work to do, and she had always been better at working than waiting, and the morning was clear and the ground would be workable soon, and she had decided exactly what was going in first. She went to start it.